I am delighted because I get to spend time today talking with Pablo Hidalgo, that's a name that everybody knows and has contributed a lot to Star Wars and to the world that we love. So, first of all, Pablo, welcome, welcome.
Hey, Ollie, always a pleasure to talk to you, Ollie.
Oh, you're the nicest. Okay, here's the level set to start with. Pablo, what is your job? Really, though, I feel like there's some nebulousness, like people don't really understand what you do. And I also feel like you have a unique job because it's one that is not, there's probably no average day. So I would love it if you would tell us what your job actually is and then kind of walk through what some average day is like for you in terms of what your responsibilities are and what kind of things get lobbed at you as surprises.
Sure. It's one of these like the bureaucratic title on next to my name is currently director franchise slash story, and that basically doesn't tell you anything, which I guess is titles do that nowadays. But if I were to describe it, it's basically a big part of my job is just to know Star Wars and to synthesize my particular experience and knowledge of this franchise that we love and provide advice to storytellers and creatives who happen to be exploring this space. Uh, my colleague Leland Chi, who I'm sure you know, and many people know, we often say like we know Star Wars, so you don't necessarily have to. Like there's a lot of trepidation or perhaps insecurity of someone first entering into this universe in a creative kind of capacity, and they're like, "Where do I go? Where do I start? What do I do?" And myself, along with several colleagues, I think there's six of us now. We've grown over the last few years. There's six of us who are really tasked to be the lore team, and we're like your Sherpas through these particular mountains. We will guide you to the story you want to tell through this path of decades and decades of Star Wars storytelling. So it's been conflated over the years. I always delight at what the internet tells me my job is. I'm like, okay, well, that's interesting. That doesn't really match my expectations, but you know what?
Right.
Everyone has theories and thoughts. But if I were to tell you what I do, that's largely it. Like an advisor, helping people out in telling Star Wars, and then a big part is when I'm collaborating with creatives, I try to capture as much of that information and energy that they bring to the table, and then communicate that outwards to all our particular partners and people who are then tasked to turn any particular piece of Star Wars into action figures, into product, into online postings, into any sort of information
Right.
that gets disseminated out to the public, rather than any filmmaker or creative having 1,000 questions nibbling at them at all times. We kind of help filter all that because, like, oh, we know what the theme is, we know what the point is, we know what happens in this scene. Let me tell you that directly so that you don't have to keep going back to a very, very busy person who's being tasked with actually, creating a Star Wars story.
This makes me wonder. I know you don't tend to work in animation, but I'm going to use an animation example because
Mm-hmm.
many moons ago I worked at Cartoon Network and like we always had an internal only like show bible for any of the properties that we did. Are you creating things like that to share with those partners, or are you more like having meetings where you explain things?
No, quite often. I mean, any sort of communications document that comes out of a chapter of Star Wars will come out of our group, and quite
Gotcha.
often I'm tasked to do that. Um, there are situations where partners may not have the capacity, the time, or the security access to potentially read a script or see something that's in development. So we will sort of be the people that will answer their questions, like, well, what's happening in this space and time in the timeline, and we're like, well, we're in a position to be able to say, well, you can go into this place, but these are the caveats you need to know, or hey, your idea is really good, but we can't use it because it's very similar to something else we're doing. If you
Right.
tweak it 8 to 10% this way, you will avoid colliding with something else that's in development.
I like that you're like an insurance policy for creatives. I really do. I mean, somebody has to be, right?
It's like traffic cop sometimes, it's like, wait, hold that thought.
I'm gonna come back to more of the nuts and bolts of your job, but I had somebody who is working on Podathon send me a little thing this morning that I didn't realize we were right at the 10-year anniversary of Expanded Universe making its transition to Legends.
Oh wow.
Which is pretty interesting. I didn't realize we were right there. And of course, we've seen, I know there were many people that were concerned that, that meant that all of that lore that they had learned and loved was no longer important. And there's a whole other discussion about canon and not getting too wadded up about it. But we've seen a lot of things from Legends make it their way into, current storytelling. Is there any particular item from those old stories that's now part of the new lore that really delights you that it made the transition?
It's well, there's a lot of pieces. I'm always amazed at the resilience and just the sheer stalwart nature of Jackson. He just refuses to die. People latch onto him, and I get it. Like I was, I'm a fan of the big, at the big swings that 1970s Marvel attempted. They didn't all work, but there was something there. There's something about the wild days where so much of this was uncharted that they took some pretty risky gambles. So, comic artists like or comic writers like Kevin Scott also like that kind of era and will pull from there. So I'm always surprised when a Hujib or Arbra or or Jackson shows up. I also I did a rare blog post or post on StarWars.com the other day at the fact that we live in the world where the Star Wars Holiday Special is alive and well in a venue as big and well attended as a Disney park. Like that blows my mind. The fact that we're able to reference a TV show that in theory, now we know the reality, in theory, no one should be able to access and watch, but obviously people are because they're finding ways to tap into that wild late 70s energy and bring it out to the world.
The best. I love it so much. Every time there's new Life Day stuff in Disney parks, I'm on it like a bonnet. I love that stuff so much. You mentioned being like the delight and surprise of some of these things getting pulled up by creators. I'm wondering how often you're like surprised or just taken off guard by a new concept that a creator brings to the table when you're, setting out these stories. Like how often are you like, whoa, I never would have anticipated that?
Oh, quite a bit, quite a bit. I mean, and that's obviously the point of having, a lot of different people come in and really just kind of express their particular love for Star Wars because, if there was for years there was a singular storyteller and that was wonderful, but it's like just being able to see these different types of stories and see what a Jon Favreau brings to the table and what a Tony Gilroy brings to the table and what a Deb Chow brings to the table. They will do things that weren't necessarily on your short list of things that you expect to see in Star Wars.
Right.
But it clearly means something to them and they bring it. And honestly, that's that's the whole point of being a Star Wars fan is like, you find your own particular avenue of expression and you get challenged and surprised and educated honestly by what someone else will bring to the forefront and say this is what Star Wars means to me and it's interesting because then you start deconstructing and you start wondering wow how did this aspect surface for you when it didn't surface for me and what does that mean and isn't that fascinating? So I think that the fact that Star Wars itself refuses to sit in a tiny little box, that it can only be one or two or three things, I think is ultimately a great testament to the strength of it.
Yeah. I like it because it makes Star Wars feel more real. You know what I mean? Like this is theoretically a galaxy full of people. So of course there are untold numbers of points of view and ideas and ideologies. And every time we get a new storyteller bringing some completely fresh concept, I'm like, yeah, that makes sense. Of course there's more of this.
Of course, yeah.
Now you are at this point, of course, so much a part of the development process on so many projects as they go from concept all the way to fruition. And as we have been saying, like the insurance policy. But I wonder if you have been there from soup to nuts. Are you ever like, as you sit at a premiere or you see a TV show premiere, are you ever able to just take off your lore and insurance guy hat and just sit back and enjoy it?
Yeah, it's not too difficult because there's usually, it helps that there's a lot of things, there's a lot of plates spinning.
Mhm.
So invariably, you find your attention drawn to one thing, you take your eye off another, because it's in good shape. You know, it's like you've already given your input, and that's when it kind of grows and becomes real. And then you revisit it, and you're like, oh wow, that's not what I imagined, or it's even bigger than what my own expectations happen to be. The other reality, when I mentioned earlier that there's six of us particularly devoted to lore, and you know, there's a larger team when it comes to development and all that. It's like no one person can do it all.
Right.
So as a result, there's enough areas in Star Wars where it's not my day to day. You know, animation and video games are things that I had to basically, you know, with regret, kind of tear myself away from because other avenues were taking more of my time. So as a result, I'm surprised and, as you say, delighted by things that appear in animation and video games where I, like, the last time I checked on them, they were just words on paper. And you know, and now they're like fully realized and rendered pieces to enjoy. So you know, I cherish that because those are where I'm surprised the most.
Do you ever get surprised by the final product of something you actually worked on? Are you ever like, I didn't know they were going to do that? Or do you know pretty much everything?
No, it depends on the nature of the project and what's going on and how busy it is. I mean, by virtue of, you know, where it was made, who was making it, and what was happening at the time, there were points where, like, you know, Rise of Skywalker surprised me because I was busy on other things, and so
Mhm.
I missed the last few cycles of it, and then it shows up. I'm like, oh, okay, that's what that is. Like, honestly, I'm sure people in the company knew it, but I had no idea what the title was until it was revealed at Celebration, and that trailer came out. I'm like, oh, well, that's a surprise. I had no idea that's what this movie was going to be called.
I guess that's what we're making. Um,
Yeah.
okay, I want to talk about one of my favorite things on the planet, and I'm going to try not to get too weird. Andor. It's
Yes.
not Rhodians. Andor, oh, is the most fantastic beast of a thing, and it's so unique. Um, when a show like that is being created that explores so much story that's outside of what we've seen before, but runs alongside it, especially the event timelines like that we as fans have gotten familiar with in our, obsessiveness over the years. What is the focus of your work like on a project like that when it's like, okay, we have to be careful of timeline, but also everything is brand new? Like, what is corralling that like?
A lot of it was like, you know, you'll hear Tony talk about it, and Tony will say, and I honestly think he's being a little, I think he's downplaying it a little bit when he talks about his awareness of Star Wars. He says, "Well, I only know the things I'm working on." I think he knows a bit more than that, but I get what he's saying. Like, he has this intimate familiarity with the points in the timeline where he's carved out and what he's creating. But he is fully aware with his commitment with the show, where he's basically doing this 5 year countdown to the event of Rogue One, essentially, you know, like in Cassian's life, that there are historic elements that he needs to intersect with. And to his credit, he does treat it like history. He wants to know, what do I need to know about the world in order to interface with it, and what are the springboards, and what are the areas to explore. And so in cases like that, we really identify it early on, and he'll, like, from an early on, um, from an early on development level, will identify key areas, like just using season one, for instance. It's like, I want to do a deep dive on the Imperial Security Bureau
Mhm.
and on Mon Mothma. What do I need to know about those kinds of things? And I will present, you know, these primers for him. Like, this is what's known. This is what's known. And then from like a screenwriting and more like day to day into production point of view, random questions may come up. Like, it's like, he wants to give aligned to Saw Gerrera or an attribute to Saw Gerrera, and he'll know that because Saw is an existing character, is that something I need to be aware of, you know.
Gotcha.
But at the same time, he's done the clever thing, he's done the creative thing, where he's got characters like Cyril, like Dedra, like all the newly created characters, where he basically has carte blanche to make them what they need to be. And honestly, to me, it's no different from telling a historical drama. You know, if you're going to tell
Yeah.
a story set in the Civil War, there's landmarks of the Civil War you need to know about, but odds are you're creating someone new that will meet the needs of your story. So, in that regard, like, Andor has been incredibly rewarding. Primarily because the principals are so willing to learn about the space and then basically, enhance it by their creations that they put in that space.
Oh, Ferrix is one of the best gifts Star Wars has given us in recent years, in my opinion. Now, the flip side of that is a show like Obi-Wan, where we know a lot about all of the players, and but we know less about those events that had to have happened in the interim. So what's the difference there, and did any interesting big questions or challenges come up when you're dealing with that knowledge set versus something like Andor that has more original pieces?
Yeah, Obi-Wan was very much more, what's the phrase, like, dancing between the raindrops of it all, right? It's like there was there was smaller gaps of free space in there to tell us things we didn't know. And even if we were going to tell us things that we didn't know and that fit, that ultimately, physically and mathematically fit, you are dealing more with a realm that people have imagined, and if people have really built a strong sense of assurance of, I know what happened between these gaps, and so there were a couple of elements that that ultimately gave us the confidence to move forward. Part of that was interfacing with George. Honestly, like, early on, there was a conversation had with George over what his thoughts were, and whether or not, honestly, he'd balk at the whole concept of, we're taking Obi-Wan and Vader again, and we're doing this, and he was 100% supportive. And I've heard tell that it's been one of the favorite things that's come out of Star Wars, is because he recognizes so much of what he did in the prequels basically brought forward and celebrated in a way that I'm sure surprised him. I'm so glad that everyone who was involved in the prequels is really feeling the appreciation that was put into that series, because that's 100% there. But we recognize there were big swings in that series. It's like, we wanted an investment in Leia, which will take people aback. It's like, I hadn't known whether or not Leia and Obi-Wan had interacted in that capacity. But then you find these threads and you find these grains, and it wasn't my pitch, but the various screenwriters that were involved in the project were able to basically show their work. They were able to surface the fact that when Luke tells Leia that he's there with Ben Kenobi, he doesn't say Obi-Wan Kenobi, he says Ben Kenobi, and Leia reacts to Ben Kenobi with a level of familiarity that kind of opened the door to tell a story of them in their past. And in the same way, like, the line that lingered on a lot of people's minds was Vader in Return of the Jedi telling Luke that Obi-Wan once thought how you did. And the prequels never gave us that quality. So among the filmmakers, among the writers, Stuart Beatty was one of them, really zeroed in on that line and wondered, does that mean that there was a confrontation, a moment where Vader and Obi-Wan conversed, and Obi-Wan was able to express that, I still think, there's good in you, and Vader closes that door. So it's funny. It's like, all these pieces were there, but honestly, the biggest reason to do it is that Ewan and Hayden wanted to do it, and they were game, and they wanted to revisit those characters. So how can you say no to that? We'll make it work. We'll find a way to make it work.
Yeah, I say all the time on Full of Sith that, like, one of the great joys of life to me as a Star Wars fan has been seeing the people that were kids when the prequels came out are now, and a lot of people my age were kind of, poo-pooing them. those kids are now of an age where they're, completely able to articulate their level of love in the same way that those of us that grew up with the OT were talking about it for years and years. And I'm like, see, it's generational, you guys. So I
Yeah,
really like that Ewan and Hayden were able to come back and like have their moment where they really do appreciate that all of those kids' lives and imaginations were sparked by them. It's a delight for me to see.
absolutely. And the thing that's happening is now, we've been at this long enough that more and more creatives are joining that were influenced by
Yeah.
not the original trilogy, but by what came afterwards. So, the proof is in the pudding. We'll see what people think once the Acolyte comes out. But I could tell you that Leslie Headland is of the prequel and expanded universe generation. Like, she, Heir to the
Yeah.
Empire meant as much to her as it did for anyone who was, really being exposed to Star Wars in the '90s in that way. So we'll see
Just
what people see. We'll see what people
just a month
derive
to
from that.
go. Just a
I
month to
know.
go. I'm hanging by a thread. I'm so excited. Okay, I want to shift gears away from the television and film stuff because you have penned a lot of things I love in the form of visual guides. And most recently, Dawn of Rebellion came out.
Mhm.
These visual guides are like crack to me. I don't know if I've ever told you that. Like, I remember when each of them has come out and I just pour over it like it's a really important and special thing, but it's because they're so thick with information and so many little cool tidbits that may not feel like they have a super amount of gravity to like the film and TV stuff, but they make everything feel more real and important. And I am forever in awe of them. I'm like, this is so much information, and so much stuff that goes into creating one of these. So can you give us kind of a broad strokes rundown of the development process on a book like that and how long it takes from inception to the day I can actually hold it in my hand, and whether or not you start fresh with each
Sure,
one, or
sure.
do you have your base document that you're always working from for those?
It's a unusual process for anyone who's written a book because it doesn't start with a manuscript that's then handed to a publisher. Design and text work hand in hand in a way that this is the only way I've ever. This is very unique to the DK approach, and I think it would be surprising to a lot of people. Basically, I am writing two layouts. I am not writing material that then they turn into a layout.
Right.
They will create the layout first with 100% Greek text in there, just fake words. And from that, I spy about how many words I need to write about a particular subject, and then I hand it over spread by spread. But before that step begins, I would say it's probably all told for a typical visual dictionary, visual guide. It's about a year's worth of work from the initial just idea and broaching the subject to, okay, we could finally ship this out. And where I like to think that I offer a degree of benefit is that we're dealing with a subject matter that I've been involved with since its early development stages. So if it's a movie, I've been there since day one, at least understanding what the topics of the movie are going to be. And so the earliest stage for me is to basically write an outline. And by outline, I just mean these are the topics we're going to
Right.
do. And in cases like I'll be as prescriptive as saying page 23 to 24 should be about this. And I know for a fact that imagery of these things exists, right? So
Gotcha.
that there's no wasted energy of me pitching, we should do a spread on this subject when in reality that subject has never been photographed.
Right.
There's no imagery to support it, or there's no, the VFX required to fill that spread won't be ready in time. So it's like, we're going to skip that, right? So basically, I send out a document that maps out what each spread's going to be. The folks at DK bless that with publishing, and then begin assembling these sort of skeleton pages with whatever assets they have available. And then they send them to me, and then I write to the layouts, and then they just keep adding it together. And every time there's a mass of pages that I can read from beginning to end, I'll take a look to make sure it doesn't feel too Frankenstein, like too written over the period of of scattered weeks, as
Right.
opposed to, okay, there's a flow to all this.
Right.
And then ultimately, depending on the subject matter, if it's about a film or TV tie-in, I will also communicate to the filmmaker, and this benefits from having a relationship with them to begin with, saying, hey, this background character, would you mind if I made them this? Or is it okay if I do this with them? And they're like, yeah, I don't care about that guy. Or they might say, no, don't touch that person because I have plans for them. So it's like, okay, that's good to know.
That's my special baby.
Exactly, right? And then depending on the production, I will always try to talk to the costume designer or the prop designers or the creature shop designers, so that I could see whether or not there's any intentionality that they want surfaced.
Right.
Sometimes that intentionality isn't, doesn't necessarily translate to an end product. It's like, this creature was based on my dog. Okay, I'm not going to turn that into something. But sometimes it does. It's like, oh, we thought this guy was an opera singer. Perfect. I'm going to keep that. This guy's an opera singer. I'll work that into their background. So, and that's honestly a reaction to seeing the way the expanded universe built out movie characters from the original trilogy, when I recognized they didn't have this sort of access. So they would occasionally take missteps. They might misidentify what a background thing was, or name something twice because they looked at two photographs and thought it was two separate things, when in reality it was one. Or, so I'm trying to avoid those kinds of missteps and discoveries by roping in as much of production as I can and capturing it in the pages of a book like that.
I recall seeing you talk about at a con years ago, working on the visual guide for The Force Awakens, and Zuvio initially having much more prominent placement, and kind of it being a really last minute shift where it was like, no, not so much with that. How often do those little surprises pop up?
It's so funny because, like, I hate to say it, but when stuff shows up in early press, 9 times out of 10, it's showing up because it's not important.
Right.
The most important stuff is being kept closer to release, or maybe even after release. But the very first thing that comes out of the gate is usually something that's been blessed by filmmakers to not have a lot of impact, but they recognize, oh, we're going to make a toy of this, we're going to make a product out of this, right? I remember, like, there was a black R2 unit that shows up in the background of Rogue One.
Yeah.
And it was like the first or the first background character to break. And it made so much press. And I'm like, why is everyone reporting on this? And I get it now. It's like, because people are excited. They want to celebrate this movie that's coming out. But they have so little to work on that they turn, a background R2 unit into a news cycle that lasts for a week. And then the movie comes out. Like, what was that all about, right?
Listen,
So
I bought that Sphero version of that black droid instantly.
So in the case of, poor old Zuvio, it's like, he was a practical costume that was on location. So we have great photography of him, and he's a cool and compelling design. And so he showed up early enough in, I think it might have been Empire magazine or something, that first showed him off. And in the absence of anything else, people were like, well, if they're showing this, if they're showing us this early, it's probably because it signifies something important. And it turns out he's in the movie for like 4 frames or something. So, but the flip side of it is, then fans celebrate, these random. I don't know what your language. If you need to bleep this out, if you do, I'll give you enough time. They celebrate their glup shittos.
Yeah.
And that's what I love about Star Wars. Is like, there are no small roles. Like, every little character gets celebrated in some capacity. And I get it.
Cabe.
Exactly.
I love them all. And I'm going to bring up another one in a little bit. When a creator comes to you with a question as they're working on story or dialogue or whatever, are there ever moments where it's not something where you're like, oh, that's this, where it opens up like a bigger question and you're like, I think we need to have a bigger meeting about this? Does that ever happen?
Occasionally. Usually we capture stuff like that early on, like in the pitch level or the outline level. So I can't think offhand something that appears so late that it's a dialogue edition. We're like, wait, what are you guys doing? What?
Right. This changes everything.
Yeah. But like, our discovery is, again, it all depends on your approach, but we use George's approach because he created the thing. It's like Star Wars ultimately is far more elastic than some people may give it credit for. It's you have a couple of things. You have a story that's told across an entire universe, so no one can know, an entire galaxy. No one can know everything, and there are places that weird stuff happens. But second, there's a filter of storytelling. Like there's, I always think that the title card a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away is our Once Upon a Time, and that gets you a lot of storytelling license. Where sometimes if you're surprised by something or it doesn't seem to add up, it's like, well, that was what the storyteller intended, and we'll worry about how it all fits together later down the line.
Okay, we're coming to the end of our time, so I want to ask the really important questions. One of the things that you have done as part of your work, both in like the visual guides and outside of them, is name things. Like big ups for Therm Scissor Punch, talking about our obscure loves. Do you have one of those that is like your favorite name you've come up with for a character or an item?
Oh, that's tough. I mean, Therm is up there just because it's so ridiculous, right? Yeah, I don't have a go-to one because it'll probably change with every project that comes along. There was one I seem to remember calling some background creature on Pisana and Okie Pokey, which is like, come on, what the hell? What was I thinking? But there's certain areas and avenues where you're allowed to be pretty crazy, and there are certain areas where I doubt I would call a Dark Lord that, but if it's
that would be sort of brilliant.
Oh, you know what? Which one I like is the Versimillipede, which was a ridiculous one. The Versimillipede is this critter that started off on Scarif, climbing up a tree, and then ultimately got moved off of Scarif during the making of Rogue One. It was a creature that kept kind of getting bumped out of shots, and then it finally landed in one shot on Jeddah. It didn't have a name. It didn't make sense to call it Scarif Tree Creature, which was its production name,
right?
For it crawling on Jeddah. And then I just remembered that one of the keywords that John Knoll would always bring up when it came to the effects approach, the ILM approach of Rogue One, was to capture the verisimilitude of the scene. So it's like, well, this is a verisimilipede. That's what that is.
I love it. I love it. It's like a little kiss to the whole thing.
Yeah.
And then finally, have you ever been stumped in that situation? Have you ever been like, I'm blocked. I don't know what this thing is.
Oh yeah. Just like, give me time.
Right.
Because sometimes like a name will, and I do this, I keep a name notebook. Finally, it took me years to figure out how to do this, where if I'm reading non-Star Wars stuff and a name will come up, like usually it's coming out of reading historical fiction. I'm like, wow, that is a great name. I'm gonna hold on to that, because odds are if I slice it, dice it, kind of basically put it through the Star Wars name food processor, it'll come out the other side, and it'll have a weight of reality, of verisimilitude, of of it won't seem as manufactured because it came from someplace else.
Just start calling everything like really boring Earth names. That's just Chris. I don't know. That's just Chris. That's just Jeff. I don't know. It's just Jeff. Pablo, thank you so much for spending this time with us today. We're always delighted to have you on Full of Sith. And of course, for the Podathon and Make-A-Wish, it's just an extra treat to have you. So many, many thank yous. Merci mille fois.
My pleasure. And we'll do this again sometime.
Okay.